almost half of mass violence shooters have histories of domestic violence. If you didn't have misogyny, I don't think you would have nearly as much terrorism. They might search online, how to talk to women, and a YouTube video pops up and they click on it and they watch it. But then their algorithm, the next video pops up has
Yeah.
incel content, or it becomes increasing. It might be a pickup artist video. And so in an effort to sort of alleviate their situation, they get exposed to content that actually, instead of giving them positive ways to deal with what they're facing, says, well, it's not your fault. It's the fault of women. They're just too choosy. They're arrogant. It's the system. And it's very, very complex and nuanced online. But as soon as those individuals engage in the real world, they're confronted with realities that don't gel with their worldview. And it tends to really, they decide that, oh, maybe this isn't the right ideology. And that's one of the reasons they leave, stop becoming an incel. They get their first job, they start university, they get their first girlfriend. And all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was.
Can you tell us about the deadliest vehicle attack in the history of Canada?
So that would be the attack where it was a vehicle ramming attack, and a young man rented a van and drove up on the sidewalk. And I want to say he killed at least 10, but I think it might actually have been more people. And it turns out that this young man was motivated, or said he was motivated by the incel ideology. So it was a mass violence attack that was motivated by misogyny, essentially, which makes it quite distinct from other types of terrorist attacks, which all have an underpinning of misogyny, but are often motivated by other factors as well. And so that young man was Alec Manossian. He's kind of interesting because he claimed to be an incel in his initial interview with the police, but then it turns out later on he sort of confessed to saying, well, actually, I just said I was that ideology because I thought it would get me more notoriety. So he's a bit of an unusual case, but he really sheds light on a group that is quite interesting, because it's what we would consider a vulnerable group of people. So people that really do need extra support and assistance, but also have the potential to become quite violent very quickly. So a group that we need to approach with a lot of caution, I think, empathy and caution.
What are incels?
Incels are a group of young men who exist entirely on the internet. And the term it was originated by a lesbian woman, and it's an abbreviation for involuntary celibate. So it started out as a group of people who wanted to be in romantic relationships and were unable to do so for various reasons. Maybe they had trouble in social situations, maybe it was their work-life balance, a lot of reasons. And so they joined together in the early years of the internet on like just one of those bulletin boards, and sort of shared their experiences to sort of understand why they felt so alone and to feel less alone. But over time, that environment evolved because the internet is a really dynamic space.
Yeah.
And it sort of got taken over by a group of young men, and it became increasingly misogynistic. And so now incels, as we use the term, they're sort of incels who are, again, that's still just really lonely, isolated individuals that want to have a romantic connection and can't. And then there's misogynist incels, which are a completely separate group. And these are incels who have defined their entire being and their entire worldview by their intense hatred of women, feminism, women's allies. And because they view the world as sort of feminist dominated, they actually have quite a lot of hatred towards just society in general, or the normies, as they call them, just normal people. And so they're essentially a misogynist group online who really just exist only online. So these people, they don't tend to have friends outside of the internet. They describe themselves as neat, so not in education, employment, or training. So they have no real interaction with the outside world, and they live in this space that becomes quite toxic. And so it's an echo chamber, self-reinforcing. And so those are what we would, when most people talk about incels, they're talking about misogynist incels, the really angry group of young men on the internet.
So a lot of them are they are not educated?
It's interesting. So they identify or self-identify as not in education. So a lot of them might be um, they're in college or they're college dropouts, or they maybe completed high school but didn't progress. But oftentimes when they're in the incel space, it's because they don't have something else that's, engaging them in the real world. So they're not currently in education or they're not currently employed. I think quite a few of them actually, they are very intelligent. Many of them are quite intelligent, but they're not actively engaged in that because that kind of forces them out of that sort of mini world that they're in. And it's hard to maintain the ideology actually once once you start engaging. So the problem, not the problem, but the interesting thing about the incel ideology or worldview is it's very brittle. And it's very, very complex and nuanced online. But as soon as those individuals engage in the real world, they're confronted with realities that don't gel with their worldview. And it tends to really, they decide that, oh, maybe this isn't the right ideology. And that's one of the reasons they leave, stop becoming an incel. They get their first job, they start university, they get their first girlfriend. And all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was. Yeah.
It is so interesting. And when, because like you said, you have incels that are just lonely, and a lot of these guys are young and they just don't know better. And then you have the group where they just hate everything women. And I
Mhm.
wonder if there's a difference between those two groups. If, because like you said, if you're interacting with women in real life and you're around women and you're around people, just regular people in real life, the experience is so different from what you hear, like the advice, some of the advice you hear online, or some of the things you hear other incels telling you. It's just, it's night and day. So I'm glad that there are people that actually just get out of it through living life, through just meeting people, getting friends, going like, oh crap, this is not what, this is not what I was expecting. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
and I think that's the really big thing that gets them to leave. Not people don't stay in cells forever. It's an ideology that's a dead end. It doesn't provide solutions to their problems. It just tells them who to blame for their problems. And so that's why it tends to unfortunately become a gateway. Either you get out of inceldom, as they call it, or a lot of these not a lot, a small fraction actually of these individuals may find themselves attracted to other sort of extreme ideologies looking for solutions. But there is an interesting, like, there's a difference between incels and misogynist incels, but it's a spectrum, right? So you might start out as an incel, you're lonely, you're isolated, real challenges that young people have today. It's really hard for people to connect, especially after COVID, the isolation of the lockdowns. And this is, it's a challenge that a lot of young people are dealing with. The what happens though is they get to a point and they search. Here's the danger of the internet. They might search online, how to talk to women, and a YouTube video pops up and they click on it and they watch it. But then their algorithm, the next video pops up has
yeah,
incel content, or it becomes increasing. It might be a pickup artist video. And so in an effort to sort of alleviate their situation, they get exposed to content that actually, instead of giving them positive ways to deal with what they're facing, says, well, it's not your fault. It's the fault of women. They're just too choosy. They're arrogant. It's the system. And then instead of, getting better and engaging, they find themselves being pulled into this part of the internet known as the Manosphere. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It talks about how horrible women are, how you need to avoid them, which just increases their isolation. And then they have this worldview that doesn't gel with reality, so they withdraw from reality. And so it's a sliding scale. You've got these really normal but just isolated lonely people, and they click on the wrong links and they don't get enough outside engagement to sort of self moderate and think, ooh, maybe that's not what I should be watching. And then before they know it, they find themselves in these spaces and with this worldview that's more harmful to them than it is helpful.
and you know what? We're starting to see, or I'm starting to see, that there's people who are starting to try to combat this almost. Like there's starting to be more people who are starting to say, hey, you're looking at this wrong, and I'll tell you why. Like I'll tell you why. So that's cool. And something else is the fact that it is. I would bet that it's mostly young men. Maybe I'm guessing that it's mostly young men because if you're a certain age and you've had enough life experience, interactions already, you just know what you know. You just know that the way things are packaged in the Manosphere community, not all of it, but in some of the more darker areas, is just lacking. It's just
Yeah.
lacking massively. So I would bet a lot of them are younger
Oh
for
yeah, you're
instance.
absolutely right. I think some incels are as young as 13. At least that's what I've seen them say online. The vast
Maybe.
majority, I would say, are under 30.
So how did you get some of this how did you get the information? I was reading you were disguised. You had to be disguised to gather some information because it's so
Yeah,
hard to
well,
get
I
that.
lurked is what I did. It's an actual methodology for online research. So a lot of incel spaces online, they're not on the dark web. They're not this evil, nefarious group. They were on Reddit for many years. They have their own website, and so basically, I went to some of the main incel forums, and I didn't log in. Like in most of them, you don't have to log in. You don't need a profile. And for ethical reasons, I don't engage with incels because they are a vulnerable population. So I don't want to manipulate them or anything like that. So basically, I just watch. So I lurk, I watch, and I see what they post. I explore particular threads. As a political scientist, I'm particularly interested in the political motivations of the incels. Are they articulating political solutions to the challenges they feel? They are, but most of them are really not feasible. Like, oh, let's create a sexual Marxist utopia where women are distributed like commodities. Don't think that's going to happen. But that's what I was fascinated in research. So basically, I just kind of float about online, and just watch the conversations unfolding because you can see people engaging. They're quite dynamic spaces. Someone will post a thread, and there'll be lots and lots of comments. So they'll engage in discussion about various topics. Of course, they'll give each other a hard time. They call it shit posting. Um, they're actually not particularly friendly spaces, incel spaces, because incels really tend to hate who they are. They think they're actually genetically inferior in many cases, which is what's so fascinating about them. The misogynist incels, they think there's this sort of sexual hierarchy based off of evolutionary biology. And they think like the attractive people, who they call the Stacys and the Chads, are at the top, and all of the women want to be with the Chads and they don't want to be with normal guys. And then guys who are ugly or awkward are just basically priced out of the sexual marketplace and are destined to forever be alone. And they think that's because they're sort of like the least genetically desirable. So they actually self identify as inferior, which is quite distinct from a lot of other sort of misogynist ideologies where men are like, I'm superior, I deserve respect. But the incels also flip that on its head. They kind of reject hegemonic masculinity, that idea of the Chad, while at the same time kind of wanting to be Chad, but also saying, well, I recognize the world for what it is, so I'm intellectually superior to everybody. So there's a lot going on there.
A lot.
Um, and so they're full of self-loathing, but they see themselves as genetically inferior, intellectually superior. It's complicated. And it creates for some pretty dynamic um, narratives at how they justify the world around them. So basically, I just watch that unfold and see what I can learn from them.
Why is it so hard to get them in a traditional setting?
A lot of it has to do with just the way society works now. Like COVID didn't help, but a lot of social interactions online, particularly if you're someone who's uh, computer savvy, you like computer games. It's not that these people don't interact with others, like they might be on gaming platforms, they might be engaging with a lot of people online, but that's the majority of their engagement, and almost always they don't have social engagement. There's a big difference between engaging online and engaging in real life. So people think the internet is an extension of the real world, and in some ways it is, but it doesn't have the sort of safety valves that face-to-face interaction does. Like if I say something way off base in a face-to-face interaction, I can see people's response. You know, there's an immediate feedback function. But on the internet, particularly depending on where you are on the internet, you might say something like really inflammatory and it'll get all the up likes and the upvotes.
The
And so the
opposite.
feedback you get is completely different. Yes. And so all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, to be popular, I have to say more extreme things, more violent things. So it's the opposite of real life interaction, but it's circular. So this online interaction does come back and feed into the real world. We're starting to see incel language, incel discourse, incel iconography on mainstream media, you know, and it's got hugely problematic, misogynistic underpinnings to it. You know, when people are saying, oh, well, it's just him being a Chad. Well, the Chad is an incel term and it's derogatory towards a group
Oh,
of
that's
people,
true.
you know, and most people recognize that now without realizing where it comes from or how problematic it is. And so there's, I think, that danger. We think, yes, the internet's like an extension of the real world, but, you know, kept safely online, but actually it feeds back into real life.
That is deep. So, okay, so you were explaining a little bit when the incel movement started forming online. Do you know why it originally started? Was frustration from for isolated men originally, and then you said it turned into something more. So I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
answer that because you already kind of
Yeah,
did.
no, that's a fair question because it's kind of like you're like, how did we get here?
Yeah, how
And
did we
yeah,
get
it started out as a self-help group, but it turned into a blaming others for your problems kind of group. So, you know, there are still some groups out there, they identify as incel and they are self-help. They want to help each other figure out how to connect with people. And those groups are completely legitimate. You know, they're just trying to make those human connections that we all want in the world. And then there's the misogynist incels who, instead of saying, no, we need to try and connect with women or whoever we're attracted to, they say, well, it's not our fault we can't connect. It's women's fault. It's society's fault. And here's why it's their fault. And the tricky part is, so that kind of belief is called the red pill. You know, they've become enlightened to the feminist cabal that is against men and structurally violent towards men and disempowering them, robbing them of the entitlements they feel like they deserve by virtue of being a man. And then it gets even worse from there. So they might say in that space and say, oh, well, we can game the system. So this is where pickup artists come in and they say, okay, well, all right, it's a feminist gynarchy, but there's ways to game the system. We can learn to play the game. We can use all these tricks to pick up women. And they're often horrible things like, you know, insulting the woman, you know, being overly aggressive. And then when these tricks don't work, because it doesn't, pickup artistry is not a successful approach, then they say, oh, well, that's the women's fault. It's not the fact that I'm being the creepy guy at the bar. And so then they take what's called the black pill, which is, okay, well, there's nothing I can do to make my situation better. So on the red pill, there's still a bit of hope. They can game the system. They also can do what they call maxing, like gym maxing or pet maxing. So, well, if I want to be more attractive and, you know, find a partner, I'll go to the gym. I'll get a job where I make a lot of money. I'll have a dog, whatever they think. Self-help. It is self-help, but in a bit of a darker
kind of darker kind of.
predatory, twisted way. But then if they take the black pill, they're like, this is it. It's hopeless. There's nothing I can do to remedy my situation. And my options are to lay down and rot. So stay home, just play video games. You know, life is hopeless. This is where they might have suicidal ideation. There's an awful lot of suicidal ideation by incels. And this is why we identify them as a vulnerable group. You know, these are people who are really, really unhappy. And I'm sure some of them out there have committed suicide, and that's something we need to really try and address. The other option, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny minority, will go out and commit mass violence attacks. And so more than 50 people have been killed in incel attacks. Like there was the Isla Vista attack, the one in Ontario, Canada, the Plymouth attack in the UK. So there's been some attacks to, now again, that's a tiny, tiny minority. The majority of incels, their ideology is much more harmful to them than it is
Oh,
to the world around them. Yeah.
right. So it's kind of like this loop. They feel like they just to kind of iterate or what you said, it's they get into the red pill space, which a lot of times is more related to pickup artistry type of things. There are some
Mhm.
guys that say that that actually works a little bit, like look maxing. They may actually get a little bit more.
Yeah, like there's ways to do it. Like if they get a good job, or
Yeah,
if they do self-improvement, they often tend to feel better about themselves. They're more confident,
yeah,
and that's
yeah,
more they're more willing to put themselves out there. It's when they start using like the what the pickup artists call the game, which is the really sort of manipulative tactics to sort of trick women
yeah,
into sleeping with you. And so there's a bit of a spectrum in the red pill. It can be kind of like positive stuff, like go to the gym, have a healthy diet, make sure you shower every day. A lot of, and that's actually, it seems kind of, trite, but a lot of people who identify as incels or that are in this space also say that they struggle with anxiety and depression. And they may or may not be on the spectrum in some aspects. And so, if you're really depressed, you have a hard time taking care of even basic things. And so when you're doing the maxing, it pushes you to try and address these things, and maybe even to seek mental health care, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, most incels and informal online polls are quite skeptical of mental health care, of psychology and psychiatry, which is unfortunate because that's probably something that could really help them. And so they instead try and turn to these tactics, and then when they don't work, they go further down into the manosphere.
yeah. I what I've heard is sometimes using the manipulative tactics actually hurts themselves more because it's like even if you do win the girl, the things you had to do to get the girl will make you feel it doesn't reward you. It's
Yeah, you don't feel good about yourself,
you don't feel
and
good
you
about
don't make a meaningful connection.
and
Like,
you
okay,
don't make
maybe
it.
you got laid, but what they're really looking for is an actual connection, and pickup artistry is absolutely not designed for that. It's for another notch in your bedpost, and that's it. And the way you got the girl is like completely undermining any approach that would lead to a sustainable relationship. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it hurts you a lot of times in the long run.
Yeah.
So okay, so can you talk about well you did kind of talk you did talk about the manosphere. Did you want to add anything to what the manosphere is?
Um, I can give the contours of it a little bit. So it's an interesting space, and obviously it's a digital ecosystem. So it's online, and it's basically a bunch of chat rooms, websites, blogs, video channels that are all sort of interconnected with each other. They're all linked to each other. Like if you end up on one, it's going to have links to all the others. And so once you end up in the manosphere, you end up just bouncing around the different sites. It's got a couple of distinct tribes in it. It's got the men's rights activists in it. It's got the pickup artists in it. It's got incels in it, and then it's got another group called the MGTOWs who are quite interesting, and that's short for men going their own way. So those are men who have decided that yes, we're in a feminist gynarchy. They've all taken the red pill, but women are just too dangerous. Like you can't interact with them because they're going to accuse you of sexual harassment.
Right.
And they actually try and completely distance themselves from society. So their goal is to ghost, to live completely off grid, away from women, outside of their manipulative influence. And those are the MGTOWs. They're actually the ones that studies have shown are the most sort of aggressive and trolling online. And so they may not engage with women physically, but they do tend to be very active online to harass women that way. So it's kind of ironic where they're like, oh, we want nothing to do with women. And then they spend a lot of their time thinking about and harassing women. And so they're the four tribes on the manosphere. There's some others. The manosphere sort of overlaps with a lot of other ideologies that I think people are going to be more familiar with, like the trad wives, the fundamentalist Christians, the alt right, the far right. There's even some overlap with sort of jihadist ideologies, again, because a lot of these things are rooted in misogyny. And so there's a lot of bleed over. So it's an ecosystem, but it's got blurry edges.
Gotcha. Yeah, so okay, so you have like the men going their own way and I've heard about them, but I haven't looked much into it. That's interesting. So, you know, it's kind of it is sad, for a lot of people because some of them really, for like them, for example, some of them really do experience, some unfair things.
Mm.
I'm sure, I do imagine, but it's just so sad to, to kind of just give up and then say like, I'm gonna be, bitter or upset. Not,
Right.
to the point where you're kind of just adding to the chaos a little. You know what I mean? You're just adding to
Yeah,
it.
they sort of compound their own harm,
Yeah.
is the thing. And I think part of it is a lack of resilience. And this is not to critique individual incels. It's just that, a lot of the incels, if you read their manifestos and listen to things that they say online, they had a particular event that's really salient for them, like a rejection from a girl or a bad interaction with a group of people at a party. And this happens to everybody. Like we've all had those awkward interactions. We've all been turned down. Um, and we bounce back. We've got resilience. You might go home and sulk and be like, that was really embarrassing. But then you go back. But for the incels, that's the turning point, and they just withdraw and they don't bounce back. And then it just gets worse from there. And so part of it is just them having the safety to feel like, and the confidence to feel like they can be rejected and still have value and still go about engaging in the real world. But yeah, it's quite interesting how there's always, many of them have that key event where they're sort of just like a really normal thing that may have happened when you were 13 and we don't even remember. For them is like a core memory, and they just can't move beyond it.
Like a central memory. And you know what? You said earlier that some of them might be autistic, and I was actually looking up some research with that because I was looking up rejection sensitivity to help the researcher explain to me like how like vulnerable we are, each of us are to rejection sensitivity. And I found that a lot of, I think people with ADHD, people and I think autistic people as well, but I could be wrong, are actually inherently, I think, more vulnerable to rejection, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
this has been a
I don't
while.
know about that one. I do
Yeah.
know that there's been a lot of studies about whether people who have ADHD and autism are more vulnerable to sort of like extremist ideologies. And by extremist, I don't mean terrorist. I mean ideologies that tend to have really black and white thinking, are extreme beliefs, not necessarily violent, but are extreme. And people were thinking, well, maybe there's an overlap because autistic people tend to really like patterns. They like clear definitions. They like, ambiguity is difficult for them. And so some
Oh,
studies have
yeah.
been done, is there a correlation between sort of vulnerability towards extremist ideologies and autism? And they haven't found anything definitive yet. So it's not clear. I do know that many incels self-identify as autistic or on the spectrum,
Okay.
but how many of them have an official diagnosis? I couldn't say. It might be one of their ways of trying to, explain why they're having such a hard time connecting with people. But yeah, I'm not sure where the research has gotten on that, but I know that that's something that people are looking into.
Gotcha. Okay, so you were speaking about the sexual hierarchy and marketplace, which seems to be central to incels, which is the Chads who are the hottest guys physically. They're the most
Mhm.
masculine guys. I think also with personality as well. They're
Well,
also
well, incels think they're thugs, but women apparently totally are into chads. Yeah.
right, right. So okay, well, yeah, okay. So the just super aggressive kind of dudes who look the part as well. And then you
Yeah,
have
they'd be
this.
the captain of your football team, those
Gotcha.
guys.
Gotcha. I wonder what they say about like the intellectuals and the more
Oh, they have a
wealthier.
whole sort of suite of like stereotypical labels they put on people. So you get the Chad, that's like 10% of men, they hit the gym. Incels actually think that Chads are also being taken advantage of by women because women are ultimately evil. But they're yeah, the hot guys. And then you've got the Beckys who are these vapid, self-interested, vain, hot blonde, cheerleader types. And then
That's
there's,
Stacy.
yeah, oh, sorry, the Stacys. You're absolutely right. I got that wrong. The Stacys. And then the Beckys are like the 6 to the 8 on the, the hotness
Oh,
scale.
okay.
The ones that are like sort of intellectual and but wears baggy sweaters and always has books with them and hair in a messy bun. Those are the Beckys. And then for the men, it's the beta males. They're the ones they want to be a Chad, but they're not. So they'll just deal with they'll take the women they can get, but the women will leave them for a Chad as soon as they have the option. And all of the Beckys and the beta males fall into sort of the normie category. They're all normies. The Chads and the Stacys are at the top. And then at the bottom, you've got all the incels. But even underneath these categories, there's subcategories. So there's names for hot Indian men. So Chad Preet, or I know, hot African American men would be the Tyrone. So they've actually got a
Oh,
label for people of different ethnicities, but they've got labels for different types of incels too. And incels, it's so interesting. There's a racial hierarchy there as well.
oh,
So we've got
why am I not
incels, but you've got, I know, why are you not surprised? Of course there is. There's the curry cells, who are incels from sort of the Indian subcontinent, the rice cells, so incels who are of Asian descent. And this is the label they apply to themselves. So not only do they feel like they're genetically inferior because they're not hot, they actually don't like themselves because of their own race. And it's just, can you just imagine how horrible that must feel? They're identifying themselves in racialized, derogatory terms. Um, and then they also use physical attributes. They're short cells. I'm an incel because I'm too short. They have neurocells, and those are the ones who say I'm an incel because I'm neurodivergent, or mental cells. I'm an incel because I have mental illness. So there's actually a great deal of nuance in their categories, but you'll notice like the categories for themselves can become quite nuanced, but otherwise it's the normies and the Stacys and the Chads, because
gotcha,
those are much more abstract for them.
gotcha. This is like if you want to have the worst type of mental self-talk in the world, this is where you would go. It's just
Oh, absolutely.
I'm telling you, it's you talk about too much positivity talk. Oh man, there's
Yeah, no, I don't think I've ever seen anything positive on an incel forum, and they'll tear each other down. So the idea that they people go to online spaces to find support is true, but because of, again, the nature of online spaces, that the opposite can be true. So incels will like be on these spaces and they'll tear each other down. So their friends, quote unquote, are actually, saying horrible things about them, and they're just agreeing. They're like, yeah, life is hopeless. I'm such a loser. And it's such a hopeless, sad space. So you really have to feel for these guys. Also, it's all guys, because in many incel spaces, women are forbidden, and incels do not believe that there can be a female incel.
okay. So there's no, it's what is it, femcells? There's no such thing, right?
Yeah, so they're like, femcells don't exist. Women can always get laid. Women, it's the powers in their favor, right? That's the way the structures go. So they don't acknowledge that women might actually face the exact same problems that they do, the difficulty connecting, the unrealistic physical expectations of what they're supposed to look like. And so most incels, misogynist incels, don't acknowledge that there can be female incels.
Yeah, because there definitely can be female incels.
Yeah.
I think it's more appropriate to say that it's probably usually easier for women to get laid, but there are girls that struggle with connecting, who have a lot of social anxiety as well, who, you know what I mean, who may struggle with weight issues a lot of times. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and you know what I mean? Or
Yeah, and I think the challenge there is like, yeah, maybe people can get laid, but can they form that actual connection, which is what they really want. And one thing that incels don't seem to acknowledge, which I think is a bit of an interesting omission, is the role of disability. There are people who are incels, men and women, who are unable to form these attachments because they've got physical disabilities, and there's sort of that societal expectation that, oh, well, you're disabled, so surely you don't have a sex drive. You don't want to, have an intimate relationship with people. And that's absolutely incorrect, right? These people deserve that type of connection as much as anyone else. And interestingly enough, that just really never never appears on their radar.
Right. Well, because it's an echo chamber of the way that they're connected is through just believing in the narrative that, the narratives that they believe. So
Mm.
it's I mean, empathizing with women is probably harder to do because they have been denied, but also because then the connection that they do have online, it's going to be vulnerable. It can be severed, which it kind of, at some point, the ones that leave, that's what makes them leave. The ideology gets challenged
Mm.
too much, to it's just they can't, like you said, it's brittle.
Yeah, and the real world gets in the way. And there's actually now um, a couple of groups online of former incels who are trying to help with that transition. There's incel exit kind of spaces where they want to help people leave the ideology. See, the challenge of any extremist ideology is it becomes your identity. So when you leave, you end up with nothing. Your social network, whether it was good or bad, is gone. All the people you considered friends are gone. Often like any connections, you're severing that and you're right back at square one. And so there's some former incels who are trying to help with that because it's hard. A lot of people stay longer than they want because the leaving is much, much harder than joining.
Wow. Wow. So something else that's important to the incel ideology is victimhood seems to be a central theme in incel ideology, and sexual Marxist, sorry, utopia seems to also be a central theme. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So incels have very much of a victim ideology. They see themselves as being victimized in three different ways. The first is they're victims of their own poor genetics. So that's, they're short, they think they're unattractive, they have a weak chin, whatever. But they think that's the first thing. Then they think they're victimized by women who only want to manipulate them as access to resources or only want, to engage with men who have good genes because women are driven by this sort of biological imperative to mate with the most genetically superior man, which is part of their ideology. And then thirdly, they're victimized by society, which fails to recognize their plight. So they say society is just organized in such a way where, incels are completely shunted aside and left loveless and alone, and society just doesn't care. So they're victimized in three ways, and this is like a core part of their identity because it leads to aggrievement. And it gives them this what they think justified reason for being angry. How dare you do this? I'm the victim here. It's my right to have these things. So there's this entitlement that's really intense and anger when that entitlement is thwarted, which is why you tend to get the violence. So that's where the victimhood comes in. And so what they would like to do in their ideal world is they actually they don't like the system. So they want to overthrow the system, the society. So kind of like when feminists say smash the patriarchy, we're like, we need to, because it's a system that's biased against women. Incels are saying smash the gynarchy because they think it's a feminist system and they want to replace it with something. And the thing that they've most articulated, but that they even acknowledge that will never happen, is the creation of sort of a Marxist utopia where everybody is governmentally mandated a partner. So, and it's based on, that scale of 1 to 10 hotness. So they would all, the tens would get the tens, the twos would get the twos. And this comes from their belief in something called the Pareto principle, which is an evolutionary biology principle that was said, back in the, so-called idealized days of like the 1950s, where monogamy was required mostly because sex outside of marriage was frowned upon, but also lack of birth control. So women had to be very careful. You couldn't have promiscuous sex. You might end up pregnant. That meant that women partnered with one man and that they stayed together. And so there were enough men and women to partner with each other. Now, because of the sexual revolution, birth control, feminism, women can partner with multiple men. They don't have to worry about getting pregnant. And incels believe women will only partner with the hot guys. So all of the women go after the 10% of chads, and then everyone else is left with the pickings. And the incels who are not hot get nothing. And that's why they think, no, we need to go back to this Marxist sort of government mandated girlfriend era where it's one for one and everybody gets a partner.
Got you. So the thing, like a lot of incels, if they're thinking that their height, okay, like physically, their height, all of these things are part of the reason why they can't get somebody. And I know there are studies that show height tends to be important and stuff like that, but the thing that I think incels miss sometimes is when you look around, this is the evolutionary story. This is the evolution story. It's you see short guys, like if you're just in the world, you see a lot of short guys with girls. You see a lot of guys who are not the most masculine looking with women, or they have somebody. So I'm so curious as to how they, well, I don't know, maybe they're just not going outside, but if you go to any city, you see a lot of differences. I just saw
Mm.
a guy who's like 4'9", and his kids were screaming at him. Like that is whatever, like he's like 4'9". So I'm not saying that there's not truth. There's not some truth. Like if you're and maybe because a lot of incels are so young and they're Gen Z and they use the internet existed from the minute they were born.
Yeah.
They're going on Tinder and they're looking at all these stuff, and women are going after the tallest guy. They're going after a guy that has a lot of
And
the
that's,
attributes.
yeah, that's a great point. And I think you're spot on. A lot of like dating apps don't help. There's not that social interaction. It really has sort of commodified dating. You look at pictures, you look at their height, you look at, it even has that
Yeah.
thing, salary range. And so, people are saying, oh, well, I'll just go for the best. But the ironic thing, and I think the irony is lost on the incels, is they say, all right, well, everyone should sort of do their looks match, as they say. So the twos should pair with the twos. The problem is incels self-identify as like a 0 or a 1, but they want the hot girl. They want the 10. And then that's where they fail. So they'll if they go out, they'll try and pick up the hottest girl there, and are unsuccessful. Or more often than not, like they'll go out and they won't even approach a woman. They'll expect the women to approach them. And then they're unsuccessful. And so while they say, you should go with your looks match, that's not what they want.
Right.
They want, they want the hottest girl there. And so that's part of the disconnect, I think. They're not, they might be like, I'm a short cell, and they want like a tall woman.
Right.
They won't go for the short women. So there's a bit of a misalignment of expectations, I think you could say.
Or they maybe body wise they're not the most fit and they want the fittest girl. But then some incels will say, if you look at online dating and stuff like that, they're going after whoever. But if I was an incel, I would just get off of, I wouldn't do any online dating. Like it's so skewed. Just go, and if you're just
Go meet
walking,
people. Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, I don't know. I'm not autistic or anything like that. I don't know. But I'm just saying that, you know, if you even just watch, just go to a city, go anywhere, you just look at the couples that are around, it's mixed up. It's mixed up. You have,
It very much is. Yeah.
yeah, it's not just Chads walking around, or I don't even want to say Chad, because now that I'm reading your research, that's actually,
You're
but
like, oh, wait, that's an insult term.
it's an insult. There's it's not just these big brooding guys, huge guys. And there's actually a lot of women who don't like them so muscular. There are women that do. There are women that do. Don't get me wrong. But there's a lot of women who don't like men
Yeah.
that are
And I
that.
think what's missed is like incels don't even take into personal preference, like people have certain desires, first of all, they don't really acknowledge that like maybe women might be attracted to other women, or they might be attracted to women and men. Like there's all that variation. But
Yeah.
also, you know, like you might have super fit athletic people that are actually like attracted to like really curvy soft people. You know, it's not like I'm this way, so my preferred opposite is just like me. You know, it just as you mentioned, you know, like you might have a really attractive woman and she likes the nerdy,
Dirty
geeky
side.
type. um,
No, seriously.
they just don't seem to acknowledge other people's desires. It's all about their desires.
But like you said, or not, like I was saying, you got to keep the the way of thinking kind of limited in order to stay in the circle and
Exactly. It's a complex but small worldview.
complex, but exactly. So why? Okay, so why do incels think the sexual revolution and feminism are responsible for the state of their lack of dating success?
Mm. Yeah, that goes to the Pareto principle. So they thought 50s women had to partner with a man and stay with that man for life. So 1 to 1. And then with the access to birth control, women finally had choice. First of all, they weren't trapped in marriages. Like they could have loans, they could buy their own houses. First of all, they didn't need men. But also they weren't limited by, okay, I can't have promiscuous sex because now women have access to things that allow that. Not that all women do, but incels believe that women are driven by this biological imperative to mate with genetically superior men. So all the women flock to the Chads. And then that has resulted in them getting nothing. And that's why. So they blame feminism for that. And the fact that women don't need men anymore. So men can't. They thought in the 50s there was sort of an exchange. Men would provide security, financial security, support to children. Women would provide children and sex. And that's how that worked. Once women didn't have to have all those things, could get their own job, could do their own things, men lost their bargaining value and all they had left was their genetics. So previously, ugly guys could make do by having a good salary. And now they think, nope, doesn't matter. Women don't care. They just want the hot guys.
Gotcha. Okay. So are there studies that show the percentage of men who are incels, of young men who are incels? I know you said one website was showing like 13,000
It's
incels.
like we can track the number of people who like are on the incel websites. It's hard because they're almost all completely anonymous. So people might have multiple usernames. They might have different usernames across various websites. The Reddit r/incels before it was banned had more than 40,000 users. And so I think a general estimate is there's maybe 200,000 people that go to the websites, whether or not they're incels or they're just curious. Maybe they're researchers like me. I ping in that number.
Right.
Versus how many are actually incels. It's kind of hard to tell, you know, because there's a lot of people that sort of dabble. They're curious, they explore, and then they leave. And there's a much smaller sort of core group of incels. And so I think, hold on, I'm going to hop on the website and I'm going to see how many users it has at the moment
Sure.
because it
Hey,
actually says. So you get the most up to date numbers if it actually says. I think last time I looked, it had 13,000 members.
at 13,000.
So currently members 27,267,
Okay.
and that's on one particular incel website. There are multiple ones. Um, and so it just depends that some incels might not go to this website, they might go to others. So it's kind of hard to say. But it's not a tiny group. It's not, you know, hundreds of people. It's thousands. It's thousands
And
of people that find themselves in this worldview.
yeah, because I think one you said on Reddit it's like 40,000 at one point. It was
Yeah,
subreddit.
at one point it was 40,000 subscribe or followers of that subreddit before it got banned. And then they migrated to a new subreddit that got banned. And then they tended, instead of all going to a single place, they scattered a bit. So it's much harder to kind of tell how many there are because they may favor different sites or platforms. Yeah.
So okay, from your data, would you say that when incels want sex or they want connection with, do they want women? Do they want sex
I
with
think,
women or?
I mean, they say the rhetorical, they talk about sex, they want to have sex, but really what they want is a meaningful relationship. I think if you go beyond the sort of bravado of, yeah, I just want to, have a hot girl in bed, they really they want a relationship. They want to connect with someone. They want someone that's a partner. The problem is their ideology now has degraded women so much that I'm not sure they'd actually be capable of having that type of relationship until they walk that back, because
Yes.
they've put themselves in a situation where they're not really ready for a healthy relationship with someone else. But I think at the core of it, that's what they want. They want to connect. When you get to the really misogynist incel websites, they've talked themselves into a position where they're not really looking for a relationship. They're looking to control. They're looking to control women and women's bodies. They don't even see women as human in some of the places on some of the websites. They say women are like dogs. You should be able to go get one and abandon it on the roadside when you're done. Like, so they're not actually after a relationship; they're after control.
But could be a lot of bravado talking. So
Yep.
okay, so this question is kind of late, but could you describe this? Can you say okay? What would you say misogyny is in
Oh
the
no, it's
world?
good to define that. So, misogyny is it's worse than sexism. So people kind of often use the two terms together. Misogyny is a hatred of women. It's this worldview where the individual believes that women are inferior to men, just inherently inferior. There's often a part of distrust to it. There's a sense of entitlement. There's a sense of being able to control. So it's this very toxic kind of perception of women. And it tends to really overlap with things like racism as well, this idea of a hierarchy of types of people. And so misogyny is beyond beyond being a bit sexist to, wanting to sort of like have someone subservient. They want women subservient to them, and they're willing to use structural or actual violence to enforce that hierarchy. Is kind of what I'd say misogyny is.
Gotcha. You talk about the different strategies, which you spoke about earlier. Um, but you said the different strategies that incels use to approach to solve their problems include hope, cope, and rope. Can
Mhm.
you explain those again?
Yeah, so incels in their online, they sort of talk about ways to deal with their inceldom, their state of being an incel. And so when they're at the red pill stage, they still have hope, right? They think there's ways to sort of make their situation better. And that's where the maxing comes in. They could go to the gym. They could, take a speaking class so they're better at dealing with people. They could get a pet. They could try and get an education so they can get a job. And so they have hope for the future. Coping is where they find ways to sort of distract themselves from their state of inceldom. So getting lost in hobbies, spending a lot of time online, gaming, watching pornography would be a cope. Rope is the suicidal ideation where they say, okay, this is where you're like, okay, there is no hope. I can't cope with this. I'm going to, think about ending my life. And then the rebellion's the one that's that small faction that are like, well, you know what, this situation's untenable. So we need to change the system. We need to kind of overthrow the current way of being and make it so that we're not this sort of marginalized, downtrodden group. But incels aren't really, they don't have a leader per se. So they're not an organized group in that way. So political action's not really their thing. So I think that's more of something I came up with when I was trying to look at their political ideology, where they're sort of talking about this future ideal, but there's really no actual underpinning for them to actually pursue that in any way.
Gotcha. Okay, and then and can you speak about you spoke about red pill, you spoke about blue pill. You said the blue pills are like the normies. They don't understand the matrix, they don't understand the truth. The red pill is the truth. And the black pill, is that the rebellious kind of strategy, the rope
That's
strategy?
like the rope and the rebellion one. So the red pill, they're like, okay, it's feminist gynarchy. We need to figure out how to live in this. This is we're awake to reality. The black pill is we're trapped in this reality and there's no way to get out. So it'd almost be like, because it's based off of the movie The Matrix, right? The blue pill is you go back to sort of living in the Matrix and not knowing you're living in the Matrix. The red pill is you wake up to the reality and you deal with it. The black pill would be Neo wakes up within the Matrix, realizes he's in the Matrix, but can do nothing about it. Is kind of what it is.
Hopeless,
Yeah, it's hopeless.
hopeless. Okay, and can you say what is gynarchy exactly?
Gynarchy, that's their version of, it's the opposite of patriarchy. So it means that the
Oh,
system itself is structured so that it preferences and supports the superiority of women over men.
okay. Okay, so what is terrorism?
Oh, that's a good question. And actually, there are hundreds of definitions of terrorism and violent extremism, and where do they overlap? So I think we could say incel is an extremist ideology, meaning it has extreme beliefs, it has black-white thinking, it has the tendency to blame others. It's not necessarily a violent extremist ideology, and that's an important distinction. So they might have extreme beliefs, but that doesn't mean they're harmful towards anyone but themselves. You know, you can be, a fundamentalist Christian or an Islamic fundamentalist and not be violent. Same with incels. When you cross that threshold to violent extremism, it's where your ideology um, it has violence inherent in it against other people. And so some incels do go cross into that, but I wouldn't say the ideology itself is a violent extremist ideology. The most violence that occurs is actually on the believers itself. So towards the incels, and it's only in rare cases that it becomes externally focused.
Okay. So you want to say it's like a form of terrorism. It's more of an extreme.
It's an ideology, and it can be an extremist ideology. Terrorism is actually a tactic. So that's when someone goes out and commits an act of violence with the intent of terrorizing the community at large. And so incels have undertaken what I would say terrorist attacks, like the Toronto van attack. That was a terrorist attack. The idea was to terrorize the community. So I absolutely would say that. Whether what putting incel as a terrorist ideology, probably not, because it doesn't have articulated enough political outcomes. Although debates are now opening up saying that misogyny might be considered a terrorist ideology. I know that the UK has actually said that it is because it's inherently violent towards women and forces its beliefs on women. And because inceldom is defined by misogyny, that does open up the door for considering that incel ideology, the misogynist incel ideology, would be considered a terrorist ideology.
Yeah,
The
you were right
debates are
about that.
ongoing.
Yeah, you said there is an undeniable link between misogyny and violence, so not necessarily terrorism. Experts say that domestic violence is a way for a male abuser to impose and enforce traditional gender roles, which are based on ideas of men having control over women. This link starts with domestic violence, but may extend far beyond the privacy of the home to include mass shootings or terrorist attacks. Recent research shows that more than 50% of mass shootings executed in the United States between 2009 and 2016 were preceded by the shooter's murder of a partner, ex partner, or family member. For example, James Hodgkinson, who opened fire at a GOP baseball practice, allegedly assaulted his daughter and was accused of abuse by two of his three ex-wives. What is the link between terrorism and misogyny?
There's a very clear link between terrorism and misogyny. So I would say almost every single terrorist ideology has misogyny as an aspect of it. But particularly violent terrorism, sorry, I suppose all terrorism is violent, but particularly acts of violence, um, are often underpinned by misogyny. It's this feeling of entitlement, that you have the right to undertake violence against other people, particularly people you perceive as inferior to you. So many, almost half of mass violence shooters have histories of domestic violence. Um, Terrorist ideologies use gender tropes to recruit, to keep their recruits as core aspects of their ideology. Like, you look at both Christian and Islamic fundamentalism, a core aspect of that is the subjugation of women. And they will undertake violent attacks, and they will often target women. They'll target women's schools, they'll target women's rights as a way of enforcing their dominance on society over other people. So it's absolutely everywhere. The misogyny in terrorism is prevalent. If you didn't have misogyny, I don't think you would have nearly as much terrorism, because they're hand in hand. It's a linking thread through all the way from domestic violence to mass violence. Misogyny is always there.
That is very interesting. What are some early warning signs that people should look out for when it comes to possible rebellion or possible
Mm.
rebellious type of attack?
I would say that it's not something that we can look out for and see in advance. I can't remember the study, but someone did research and said often incels, when before they do a violent attack or a they'll post something online. So they'll post up their manifesto, they'll make a post, but the time between that post and the attack is less than an hour and a half, I think. And if the post is anonymous, if someone doesn't see it for a while, if someone doesn't report it for a while, like, it's just impossible for us to monitor and respond to all of those things. Often because a lot of times they shit post. And so they'll say, watch out, there's going to be an attack, and then nothing happens. And so there's really nothing we can watch out for um, previous to a mass violence attack, um, because incels are already quite withdrawn. So they're not interacting with people. They're interacting online, and we can't police the entire internet. We don't have the resources, and there's no governance really of the internet. And so the key thing that people need to look out for, is particularly preceding mass violence attacks, is less related to incels, but in general, it's people gathering weapons and ammunition, coming together, um, but also doing the same things that people do before they commit suicide, like giving away personal belongings, things that they would actually cherish, because oftentimes when they commit these attacks, they intend to die in the process. So connecting those things together, but it's incredibly hard. So it's it would be a lot more efficient to try and address the underlying grievances that drive people towards the incel ideology, rather than trying to address the outcomes, because
Right.
it's just a tiny fraction of incels. So it'd be better prevention, I would say, is much better than trying to deal with the outcomes of it.
Definitely, definitely. How can we address the ideology better? You were writing about how media likes to talk about mass shootings, linking it to mental health issues a lot, and they don't point out the misogynistic element to that's related to that a lot of times. And the reason why this could be important is because, for example, if you have a history of beating women or domestic violence, the gun when you're trying to get a gun, it's important to know that, especially if
Mm.
50%, as high as 50% of mass shootings in the US between 2009 and 2016 were done by people who had a history of that. That's a huge marker. That's a huge
It is.
indicator. Yeah.
It's a huge red flag. So, like, if we want to deal with the ideology, first of all, we need to foster spaces, healthy physical spaces for young people to engage, interact, meet. We do need some kind of governance structures for online spaces that have clear guidelines about this type of behavior is not appropriate. It's up to individual websites to decide what their guidelines are and where the
Right.
red lines are.
Right.
And so we need to have, a systematic approach to that. And actually, I think the UN just passed their Pact for the Future. And part of it had a digital aspect to it, where they're talking about governance of the online spaces, because they know that there's these spaces should be places for connection, not radicalization. So we
Right.
need to do that. We need to support people. I do think mental health care is a big part of it, but also supporting individuals that might have social cognitive challenges so that they can meaningfully interact. I'm in Australia, which has fairly good healthcare system and support for people like that. But I know in lots of places in America, that's not a luxury that people have. There isn't those support networks for people who are struggling, particularly kids and young people, just aren't there. You can't afford to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It's far too much money. Your insurance doesn't cover it, or you don't have insurance. And those things would go a long way towards alleviating sort of the push factors that drive people into this ideology and help them have meaningful lives because they're able to connect with people. So I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Really trying to help, giving social workers training into understanding
Yes.
what this ideology is and how to identify it so they understand it. Because oftentimes, I know particularly there's a generational gap. People who didn't grow up with the internet don't understand sort of like how it works. They don't understand the buzzwords. So they might hear someone using this language and not really understand what it means. The fact that it means that they're sort of getting sucked into a particular ideology. So training for people that are at the pointy end, and healthcare workers as well, understanding what they might be seeing.
Could you could you say some of the what are some buzzwords? Red pill, black pill, blue pill.
Yeah, so if they start talking about the red pill, black pill, they say Stacy, Chad, Becky, or all the normies do this, and talking about in ways that are with really broad stereotypes, like so their worldview is very much about like the world's all one sort of hegemonic ideal, like showing that they're really not engaging with the real world. They're spending a lot of time online.
Mm, yeah.
There's
Oh.
being able to recognize that, I think would, particularly people who are working with kids, realizing, okay, well, this individual's spending a lot of time online.
Mm,
Where are they spending their
good
time?
point.
What kind of ideologies, what influences are they getting? Often parents have no idea what their kids are getting into. And it's a fine line between ensuring young people have autonomy and privacy, but also parents being acknowledging that the internet can be a dangerous place. And it can really harm people if they're not aware of what their kids are doing. I know that there's been a huge rise in sexploitation of young people. And the parents just have no idea it's happening. So even just more information for parents and teachers to understand what these spaces are like and how they can be instrumentalized.
That is a beautiful point, Sharon. Shannon, sorry. Excuse me.
Okay.
That is a very, very good point. Just thinking about the fact that if someone's spending a lot of time online, maybe you should have I don't know if people are gonna admit to what they're doing, but you don't know. A conversation about certain things might make somebody open up. You know what I mean? Like
Oh,
if you're
absolutely. Just saying, like, where do you go? What do you do? People like don't let them do X, Y, and Z. Know that you can come to me if you've got problems. Because young people explore, they want to push the edges, they want to see new things, they like to do stuff that's forbidden. We're all young, but some of it can get really, really dark really fast. And particularly if it's a young person that's, 13, 14, 15, they're very vulnerable. And that can be overwhelming. And they don't know who to turn to. So even just having, in Australia, we've got like the e-commissioner, like someone that actually you could turn to if things happen online. Just letting people know that, there's a number you can call if you're being sextorted or if someone's threatening you online, knowing who you can turn to. Because oftentimes I know if something happens online and they turn to the police have very limited jurisdiction and capability to deal with these things. So who do we go to for help if something happens online? Um, just knowing who that is or having someone can make a big difference.
That's right. That's right. So I'm gonna this part I'm gonna take out, but I do wanna I don't know if you want me to, well, you do have the book coming out. some people don't want me to say, hey, how can people reach you? Is that
The
fine?
book's not written yet, so it's gonna be a while. It's only half done. I gotta finish it.
Okay, okay, cool. No, you have a lot of good information. So is it cool if I say, Shannon, how can people reach you?
I'd actually prefer they not,
Right, right,
because
right.
incels might
That's what
them incels might come after me. I'm sorry.
exactly. That's why I'm
Yeah,
like, I don't
just because of
yeah,
what we're talking about.
right,
Yeah.
right, right.
I mean, someone can Google me and they'll find my work profile. But I don't have social media for that
No
reason.
social media. No. Um,
I
I was
appreciate you asking. Thank you.
yeah, no, no, no. I'm starting to ask that now because I'm starting to realize that some researchers are like, no.
Yeah, like it depends on what you research. Like sometimes you don't want
Yeah,
them reaching out to you.
sometimes we don't. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay. Well, I'm gonna say, okay, well, thank you, Shannon, for coming on and talking to us, educating us about this culture a little more.
That's been my pleasure. We still have a lot to learn. So hopefully as we get more informed about this, we can find a way to help out the people that are stuck in this ideology.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.